Imagine, if you will, the biting cold of a winter's night, far away from the warmth of the hearth. The wind howls outside, pushing icy gusts against the sturdy walls of a wooden longhouse. Inside, the flickering fire does little to push back. The chill that creeps along the walls, through the cracks in the door, and over the frozen ground. The hearth may be burning, but the cold remains persistent, settling in the bones of those who reside within. This was the harsh reality faced by the Vikings during the long winter months. To them, the seasons were not simply a change of temperature, they were an unforgiving test of survival. Picture yourself there, huddled with your family, your breath visible in the cold air. Outside, the darkness stretches endlessly, and the snow falls softly, blanketing the world in a silent white. For months, this cold would not relent, making daily life a battle against nature itself. As we drift back in time, the winters of the Viking Age were even more severe than we often imagine. The temperature dropped lower than most of us could ever truly grasp. During this period, the region, now known as Scandinavia, faced winters so cold that rivers froze solid, lakes became impassable, and the very land seemed to hold its breath in frozen stillness. The Vikings, living in this harsh landscape, were forced to adapt to the bitter cold, not as an occasional inconvenience, but as an ever-present challenge. In the modern world, we might complain about a cold front moving in, or a harsh winter. Storm yet, these pale in comparison to the winters the Vikings endured. Temperatures could drop as low as minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius in some areas. A degree of cold that would be nearly impossible to endure without the protections we now take for granted. But for the Vikings, there was no warm home with central heating. There were no thick coats of modern insulation or fireplaces with easy access to dry wood. Instead, they relied on the meager warmth from their hearths, the strength of their shelters, and their sheer resilience to survive. In fact, research into the Viking climate suggests that they experienced periods of extreme cold, particularly during the Little Ice Age, which spanned from roughly the 14th to the 19th century. But even before this time, Viking settlements faced long, dark winters that stretched from early autumn to late spring, making every year a test of endurance. This was not the kind of winter we see in modern cities, with salted roads and snowplows. This was a winter that lasted not just for weeks, but for months, where every day was a struggle against the elements. These long winters shaped Viking culture and their way of life in ways we may not fully appreciate today. It was more than just a seasonal hardship. It was a defining part of their existence. Understanding how the Vikings survived these brutal winters can provide us with a clearer picture of their remarkable resilience, the depth of their community bonds, and the ways in which they adapted to an environment that often seemed as though it was trying to claim them. As we begin to unravel the story of Viking winters, let us quietly turn to their homeland, the icy shores, the snow-covered forests, and the cold, distant mountains that became the backdrop for their enduring strength and culture. Through this lens, we will begin to understand how these extreme conditions made their winters even worse than we might ever have imagined. Ask ChatGPT. The Vikings, those legendary seafarers, warriors, and explorers, are often remembered for their daring raids, their long ships cutting through the seas, and their epic sagas that echo through the corridors of history. Yet, beneath their fearsome exterior lay a culture forged by the very land they inhabited, land that was not kind to those who called it home. The Vikings hailed from Scandinavia, a vast, rugged region in northern Europe that includes modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. It is a land of soaring fjords, dense forests, and towering mountains, but it is also a land where winters stretch long and hard, leaving little room for comfort. To understand the true nature of the Viking experience, one must first understand the land they inhabited. In the winter months, the northern lights shimmered across a dark, endless sky, but for the Vikings, this beauty was paired with extreme conditions. Snowfall could blanket the ground for weeks, even months, and daylight hours were fleeting, often lasting only a few hours a day. As the temperature dropped, so did the Vikings' chances of easily gathering food or staying warm. The landscape, while breathtaking in its natural grandeur, became a challenge to survival. Viking settlements were scattered across the Nordic region, often tucked into small valleys or along the rugged coastlines. These homes were built to withstand the harsh elements, yet even the best-made longhouses were not invincible against the cold. Constructed primarily from timber, with roofs covered in sod or thatch, these houses were designed to protect from the wind, but they were far from perfect. The roofs could leak, and the walls, though sturdy, still let in the biting cold. Inside, families huddled around a central hearth, their warmth dependent on the flickering flames of a fire. But fires, too, were fickle in their ability to ward off the biting chill. The walls were cold to the touch, the floors frozen underfoot, and the hearth, despite all its warmth, could only reach so far. In the Viking homeland, the winter season was not just cold, it was an enduring presence, a constant companion. The winters were long, often beginning in early autumn and not releasing their grasp until the end of spring. And during these months of frozen stillness, the Vikings were isolated. Their cities and villages were small, often a day's travel or more from the next settlement. With the cold came a kind of silence, a stillness that was broken only by the sound of the wind or the crunch of snow underfoot. For months, families lived in this isolation. Their survival depended on their ability to endure. Now, let us think about the Vikings not as invincible warriors, but as individuals, much like ourselves, trying to survive in a world that seemed to be in constant winter. It is easy to imagine the courage it would take to wake each morning in such conditions, to face the cold and the dark, knowing that food was scarce and the days of warmth and sunlight were far off. This was the Viking reality, a life shaped not by the gentle ebb and flow of seasons, but by a relentless struggle against nature itself. The long, harsh winters influenced every aspect of Viking life. Their survival strategies, their family structures, and even their mythology were all deeply entwined with the seasonal changes of their homeland. The extreme cold affected how they built their homes, how they stored their food, and even how they traveled. And yet, despite these constant struggles, the Vikings became one of the most successful seafaring cultures in history, navigating vast oceans, raiding distant lands, and leaving a legacy that endures to this day. As we explore the Vikings' relationship with their environment, we begin to see how these bitter winters shaped their culture in ways that were both profound and necessary. They had to adapt to survive, and their ability to endure these long, cold months is a testament to their resilience. Understanding the severity of Viking winters helps us better appreciate how the Vikings developed their culture, their customs, and their worldview, a culture forged in the fires of the harshest of winters. Let us now, quietly, turn to a closer look at the Viking winters themselves. What made them so brutal? How did the extreme cold influence everything from their daily routines to their very survival? As the wind howled through the cracks in the longhouse, the flames in the hearth flickered weakly, casting soft shadows against the walls. The days were short, and the cold was constant, pressing against the wooden beams of the house. It is in these conditions that the true brutality of Viking winters becomes clear. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was a pervasive force, shaping every aspect of daily life. The temperatures in the Viking homeland could plummet to extreme lows, especially during the winter months. While modern Scandinavia experiences cold temperatures that can dip below freezing, the Viking Age was subject to even harsher conditions, particularly during what we now refer to as the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, which began around The 14th century brought colder temperatures to much of northern Europe. This period saw glaciers expanding, rivers freezing over, and growing seasons shrinking, all of which meant longer and colder winters. During these bitter cold months, it was not uncommon for temperatures to fall well below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius. In some areas, the coastal regions of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were not spared from the freezing grip of winter. The once mighty rivers, which during the warmer months flowed freely, were now covered in thick ice. Even the sea froze in places, cutting off the Vikings' access to their vital maritime routes. For a people who depended on the sea for trade, travel, and raids, this was a dangerous and difficult time. Without the ability to travel across the water, they were left isolated in their villages, forced to rely on what little resources they had until spring. The cold, however, was not just something the Vikings had to endure during the coldest months. It lingered. It lingered in the sharp winds that cut through every crack in their homes, in the ice that clung to their ships and tools, and in the frost that crept into the very marrow of their bones. It was a cold that did not relent, and its presence, like an unwelcome guest, stayed far longer than any modern-day winter we might experience today. But how did this bitter cold affect the Vikings? It wasn't just the discomfort of the cold that threatened them. It was the very real danger that it posed to their survival. When winter set in, the Vikings faced enormous challenges in both their farming and their health. Cold and its impact on Viking farming was the backbone of Viking survival, providing food for families and ensuring that the community could withstand the cold months. However, during the winter, farming activities came to a halt. The frozen soil made it impossible to plant or harvest crops. The cold also meant that food supplies, stored for the winter, were often vulnerable. The Vikings had learned to store food, salted fish, dried meats, and root vegetables during the warmer months to ensure they would have enough to survive the lean winter period. But with no refrigeration or modern preservation methods, even stored food could be affected by the cold. Root vegetables, such as turnips and carrots, were often stored in pits to keep them from freezing. But prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures could cause even these hardiest crops to rot or spoil. The animals that the Vikings raised, such as cows, sheep, and goats, also faced difficult conditions. The cold meant that grazing was nearly impossible, and feeding these animals became a matter of great importance. Fodder had to be carefully rationed, and without enough food, livestock would become weak or even perish from starvation. This in turn affected the Vikings' access to milk, meat, and wool, the very things that helped sustain them through the harsh winter months. Health hazards of the cold. The Viking body, though strong and resilient, was no match for the extreme temperatures they faced. The bitter cold of winter could cause a host of health problems. Hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold-related injuries were common during the winter months. The cold air would creep into the smallest cracks in the longhouses, freezing the inhabitants from the tips of their toes to the tips of their fingers. No amount of woolen garments or thick furs could fully shield them from the harshness of the wind and the cold that seeped in even with the fire burning. Frostbite was a particularly dangerous threat. Fingers, toes, and ears were the first to feel the effects of frostbite, turning numb and pale as the blood flow slowed and eventually stopped. Without modern medicine, frostbite could easily lead to gangrene and infection, resulting in amputations, or in the worst cases, death. Vikings, like many ancient peoples, had no choice but to endure these dangers, knowing that survival depended on their strength and determination. Beyond the physical effects, the psychological toll of winter was also profound. The long, dark nights and isolation had a powerful impact on the Vikings. Imagine weeks or even months of darkness, with only the flickering light of a fire and the company of a few family members or fellow villagers. The cold meant that the Vikings had limited options for recreation or distraction. The endless hours of cold and darkness could weigh heavily on the mind, leading to a sense of cabin fever and despair. Despite their fierce reputation, the Vikings were human, and the harsh winter months tested their resilience in ways that would seem unimaginable today. Lack of shelter and heating Viking homes, though sturdy, were not perfectly insulated against the cold. Longhouses, the center of Viking life, were typically built with wooden beams and roofs covered with sod or thatch. These materials helped to keep out some of the wind and cold, but they were not enough to stop the chill entirely. While the hearth at the center of the longhouse provided some warmth, it was far from sufficient to heat the entire house. The heat from the fire would rise, and much of it would escape through the roof. The stone floor remained cold, and the walls, though strong, were far from perfect at blocking out the freezing temperatures outside. In many longhouses, families would huddle together for warmth, with the central hearth acting as the focal point of both cooking and heat. But with only a small fire to protect them, the cold could creep in from all directions, leaving the Vikings constantly battling the chill that clung to the air. The cold would seep into their bones, making sleep uncomfortable and work harder. The isolation of winter, coupled with these harsh living conditions, would have created an environment where survival itself was an everyday challenge. As the wind howled through the cracks in the longhouse, the flames in the hearth flickered weakly, casting soft shadows against the walls. The days were short, and the cold was constant, pressing against the wooden beams of the house. It is in these conditions that the true brutality of Viking winters becomes clear. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was a pervasive force, shaping every aspect of daily life. The temperatures in the Viking homeland could plummet to extreme lows, especially during the winter months. While modern Scandinavia experiences cold temperatures that can dip below freezing, the Viking Age was subject to even harsher conditions, particularly during what we now refer to as the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, which began around the 14th century, brought colder temperatures to much of northern Europe. This period saw glaciers expanding, rivers freezing over, and growing seasons shrinking, all of which meant longer and colder winters. During these bitter cold months, it was not uncommon for temperatures to fall well below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius. In some areas, the coastal regions of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were not spared from the freezing grip of winter. The once mighty rivers, which during the warmer months flowed freely, were now covered in thick ice. Even the sea froze in places, cutting off the Vikings' access to their vital maritime routes. For a people who depended on the sea for trade, travel, and raids, this was a dangerous and difficult time. Without the ability to travel across the water, they were left isolated in their villages, forced to rely on what little resources they had until spring. The cold, however, was not just something the Vikings had to endure during the coldest months. It lingered. It lingered in the sharp winds that cut through every crack in their homes, in the ice that clung to their ships and tools, and in the frost that crept into the very marrow of their bones. It was a cold that did not relent, and its presence, like an unwelcome guest, stayed far longer than any modern-day winter we might experience today. But how did this bitter cold affect the Vikings? It wasn't just the discomfort of the cold that threatened them. It was the very real danger that it posed to their survival. When winter set in, the Vikings faced enormous challenges in both their farming and their health. Cold and its impact on Viking farming was the backbone of Viking survival, providing food for families and ensuring that the community could withstand the cold months. However, during the winter, farming activities came to a halt. The frozen soil made it impossible to plant or harvest crops. The cold also meant that food supplies, stored for the winter, were often vulnerable. The Vikings had learned to store food, salted fish, dried meats, and root vegetables during the warmer months to ensure they would have enough to survive the lean winter period. But with no refrigeration or modern preservation methods, even stored food could be affected by the cold. Root vegetables, such as turnips and carrots, were often stored in pits to keep them from freezing. But prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures could cause even these hardiest crops to rot or spoil. The animals that the Vikings raised, such as cows, sheep, and goats, also faced difficult conditions. The cold meant that grazing was nearly impossible, and feeding these animals became a matter of great importance. Fodder had to be carefully rationed, and without enough food, livestock would become weak or even perish from starvation. This in turn affected the Vikings' access to milk, meat, and wool, the very things that helped sustain them through the harsh winter months. Health hazards of the cold. The Viking body, though strong and resilient, was no match for the extreme temperatures they faced. The bitter cold of winter could cause a host of health problems. Hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold-related injuries were common during the winter months. The cold air would creep into the smallest cracks in the longhouses, freezing the inhabitants from the tips of their toes to the tips of their fingers. No amount of woolen garments or thick furs could fully shield them from the harshness of the wind and the cold that seeped in even with the fire burning. Frostbite was a particularly dangerous threat. Fingers, toes, and ears were the first to feel the effects of frostbite, turning numb and pale as the blood flow slowed and eventually stopped. Without modern medicine, frostbite could easily lead to gangrene and infection, resulting in amputations, or in the worst cases, death. Vikings, like many ancient peoples, had no choice but to endure these dangers, knowing that survival depended on their strength and determination. Beyond the physical effects, the psychological toll of winter was also profound. The long, dark nights and isolation had a powerful impact on the Vikings. Imagine weeks or even months of darkness, with only the flickering light of a fire and the company of a few family members or fellow villagers. The cold meant that the Vikings had limited options for recreation or distraction. The endless hours of cold and darkness could weigh heavily on the mind, leading to a sense of cabin fever and despair. Despite their fierce reputation, the Vikings were human, and the harsh winter months tested their resilience in ways that would seem unimaginable today. Lack of shelter and heating. Viking homes, though sturdy, were not perfectly insulated against the cold. Longhouses, the center of Viking life, were typically built with wooden beams and roofs covered with sod or thatch. These materials helped to keep out some of the wind and cold, but they were not enough to stop the chill entirely. While the hearth at the center of the longhouse provided some warmth, it was far from sufficient to heat the entire house. The heat from the fire would rise, and much of it would escape through the roof. The stone floor remained cold, and the walls, though strong, were far from perfect at blocking out the freezing temperatures outside. In many longhouses, families would huddle together for warmth, with the central hearth acting as the focal point of both cooking and heat. But with only a small fire to protect them, the cold could creep in from all directions, leaving the Vikings constantly battling the chill that clung to the air. The cold would seep into their bones, making sleep uncomfortable and work harder. The isolation of winter, coupled with these harsh living conditions, would have created an environment where survival itself was an everyday challenge. As the Viking winter months pressed on, food scarcity became an ever-present concern. The lack of fresh produce, the difficulties in hunting and fishing, and the limited supply of stored food all created a tense atmosphere in which survival was a constant struggle. The Vikings had to rely on what they had stored during the warmer months, and this was not always enough. While salted fish and dried meats could last through the winter, they were often bland and difficult to eat in large quantities. Root vegetables, too, were hardy enough to last through the cold, but even they were not immune to the effects of the freezing temperatures. And then there was the challenge of fresh water, as rivers froze solid, making it hard to access fresh drinking water. In many cases, Vikings were forced to melt snow to drink, a slow and labor-intensive process. As the winter months stretched on, the Vikings faced the challenge of rationing their stored food. With the harsh conditions of the frozen landscape, hunting and fishing became nearly impossible. The once abundant supply of fish and game was now hidden beneath thick layers of ice, leaving the Vikings to rely on what they had stored months before. They had to carefully manage their supplies, ensuring that nothing went to waste, but even the most meticulous planning couldn't always prevent shortages. The Vikings' diet during winter was limited to preserved foods that could withstand the cold. Salted fish, which had been caught during the warmer months and preserved for winter, were a mainstay. But this diet, while sustaining, was not always enough. The lack of fresh vegetables or fruits meant that the Vikings had to rely on root vegetables, like turnips, carrots, and onions. These hardy plants could withstand the cold, but after months of eating the same foods, the Vikings' meals became monotonous and lacking in variety. The weather also limited their ability to gather new supplies. The freezing temperatures made it difficult to forage for wild berries or herbs, and the snow-covered ground prevented them from hunting or gathering wild plants. Livestock, which could provide milk, meat, and wool, were also affected by the harsh conditions. The cold meant that grazing was scarce, and animals needed to be carefully tended to in order to survive. Even small failures in the management of livestock could result in the loss of valuable food sources. Cattle, sheep, and goats were often kept in barns or longhouses to protect them from the cold, but without sufficient feed, even they would struggle to survive. The Vikings' food supply was a delicate balance of careful preparation and constant vigilance. Any disruption to this balance could mean starvation. When crops failed or food stores were depleted too early, it could lead to severe famine, and entire villages could be wiped out by hunger. One bad harvest, one winter of insufficient food, could lead to tragedy. This constant threat of starvation added another layer of stress to the already difficult lives of the Vikings during winter. The Vikings relied on their ability to store food during the warmer months to get them through the winter. But this was not always enough, especially in years when the weather was particularly harsh. A bad harvest could mean a devastating loss of food. For the Vikings, the failure of one crop could have disastrous consequences, as they had no way to supplement their diet with imported food or modern preservation techniques. When harvests were poor, the Vikings turned to rationing. Rationing was not just a matter of managing limited food. It was an art, a way of life. The Vikings knew that every scrap of food counted, and they were experts at making what little they had last. Meals were often smaller and less varied, with families carefully dividing what little they had. They relied on salted meats, dried fish, and root vegetables to survive, but each meal was a reminder of how fragile their existence was. In times of food scarcity, the Viking community would often pull together, sharing what little they had with neighbors and relatives. The social structure of Viking society, built on strong familial bonds, helped to ensure that no one went hungry if it could be helped. The village or community became a lifeline during these times, with food being shared between families to ensure that all could survive. However, despite their best efforts, there were times when rationing could not save them. The toll of food scarcity on Viking society was severe. Weakened immune systems, stunted growth in children, and the physical toll of malnutrition were common consequences. Prolonged hunger. The lack of sufficient nutrition left the Vikings more susceptible to illness. which could spread quickly in small, isolated communities. The constant battle against hunger and cold took a toll not only on the body, but on the spirit, as the Vikings were faced with the harsh reality of their fragile existence. Beyond the physical effects, the constant worry about food scarcity and survival had a profound psychological impact on the Vikings. Imagine the fear that would grip a family when food stores began to run low, knowing that the next few months would be filled with uncertainty. The weight of this fear, the constant struggle for survival, could wear down even the strongest individual. Viking mythology often reflected the harshness of their world, with gods and heroes alike struggling against the cold and the elements. But these myths were not just stories of battle and glory. They were a way for the Vikings to understand and cope with the relentless challenges of their environment. The psychological resilience needed to survive such winters was built into their culture, with stories of bravery, endurance, and sacrifice, serving as reminders of the strength required to face these adversities. The Vikings also used the long winter nights to reflect on their lives, to plan for the coming year, and to bond with their families. Despite the isolation and harsh conditions, winter was a time of social connection. It was in these moments of quiet reflection and shared hardship that the Vikings found their strength. Together, they could weather the cold, share the burden of hunger, and face the darkness of winter with resilience. Winter, for the Vikings, was not just a physical struggle. It was a deeply psychological one as well. The extended isolation, the dark and cold nights, and the constant threat of food shortages all contributed to the emotional toll of the winter. Months, for weeks, sometimes months, the Vikings were confined to their homes, cut off from the outside world by snow and ice. The cold, relentless darkness of winter seemed to stretch on without end, and this isolation had a profound effect on their mental well-dash. Imagine being in a small village, surrounded by snow-covered mountains and frozen forests, with no means of communication beyond the close-knit community you live in. The cold presses in from all sides, and the darkness of winter feels like it will never end. The Vikings, like all people who endure extreme isolation, were forced to confront the loneliness and the psychological strain that came with it. The long winter nights were filled with uncertainty. There was little to do beyond tending to the fire, fixing tools, or making small talk with family members. For many, the winter months meant hours of sitting by the fire, waiting for the cold to subside, for spring to return, for a chance to escape the confinement of the longhouse. These long stretches of isolation and the constant struggle for survival would have weighed heavily on the minds of the Vikings. The isolation that came with winter was not just a physical one. The lack of sunlight for much of the day also contributed to feelings of depression and melancholy. The absence of sunlight meant that the Vikings had little natural light to guide their way through the cold months, and the long nights seemed to stretch on endlessly. This lack of light affected not only their moods, but also their ability to work and to think clearly. Seasonal affective disorder, a condition linked to long winters and lack of sunlight, may have affected the Vikings as much as it does so. People today but despite these hardships, the Vikings developed a remarkable resilience. They understood that winter was a time of endurance, a time when only the strong survived. This resilience was woven into the fabric of Viking culture. The concept of word or fate was central to their worldview. To the Vikings, the challenges of winter were not just obstacles to overcome. They were part of the natural order, a test of their strength and will to survive. The Vikings did not simply accept their fate, however, they fought against it. They faced winter not with despair, but with determination. The harshness of the cold, the scarcity of food, and the isolation only made them more determined to endure. It was in the face of adversity that the Vikings found their true strength. This resilience was passed down through generations. not just through the stories of gods and heroes, but through the lived experiences of everyday people who faced the cold year after year. In these trying months, the Vikings' survival was often dependent on their ability to rely on each other. Families and villages formed tight-knit communities, with everyone playing a role in ensuring the survival of the group. This sense of community was vital during the winter months when resources were scarce, and isolation was a constant threat. The communal aspect of Viking life was not just about physical survival, it was about emotional support as well. The bonds, forged in the cold, dark winters, were strong, built on the shared experience of hardship. It was in these moments of shared struggle that the Vikings found their strength, relying on each other for warmth, both physical and emotional. The winter months, though long and hard, were also a time of reflection, of storytelling, and of bonding. As the first chill of winter settled in, a deep silence swept across the Viking lands. The once thriving rivers and seas that had carried Viking ships on expeditions to distant shores now lay dormant beneath a thick, glassy layer of ice. The air, bitter and sharp, pressed against the skin, as though the very atmosphere was frozen, still, and waiting. The Vikings, whose culture had been built around motion, the swift strike, the long voyage, the ever-moving longship, now found themselves bound by the harsh embrace of winter. The days grew shorter, and the land, blanketed by snow, became an eerie quiet. The once bustling Viking settlements, filled with the sounds of hammers on iron, the cries of warriors preparing for battle, and the hum of bustling trade, were now subdued. Only the crackling of the fire in the longhouses could break the stillness, echoing through the frozen air, like the heartbeat of a people waiting for the thaw. For the Vikings, this was more than a mere seasonal change. It was a time of forced stillness, when their usual ways of life were brought to a halt by nature's icy hand. For the warrior-class Vikings, this winter stillness was not just a temporary inconvenience. The harsh winter months meant that their raiding expeditions, the very lifeblood of their culture, would come to a complete standstill. No longer could the mighty Viking ships cut through the waves of the sea, their prows slicing through the water with speed and precision. No longer could the Viking warriors raid the coasts of distant lands or venture far across the seas in search of treasure and glory. The frozen waters acted as both a physical barrier and a psychological weight that pressed down on the Vikings. The thrill of battle, the excitement of the journey, and the ever-present call of adventure were muted by the cold, long winter nights. In this time of isolation, even the heart of the Viking warrior seemed to slow, weighed down by the knowledge that for months their seafaring raids would have to wait. The Viking longship, often regarded as one of the greatest technological advancements of its time, was a marvel of design and purpose. With its shallow draft, the longship could navigate not only the open seas, but also rivers and fjords, allowing the Vikings to launch raids in places other ships could not reach. It was these vessels that made Viking raids so swift and feared. Yet, when the harsh winter months arrived, even these ingenious ships were powerless against the ice. The rivers that had once carried Viking ships to far-flung lands now lay frozen under a blanket of ice, thick and impenetrable. The mighty Baltic Sea, which had allowed Vikings to travel swiftly between Denmark, Sweden, and the rest of Europe, was now still and cold, the surface completely covered by a thick sheet of ice. The icy grip of winter transformed what were once vital highways for the Vikings into frozen obstacles. It was as though the sea had turned against them, its once friendly waves now turning to ice, a harsh reminder that even the mightiest of forces were subject to the whims of nature. Without their longships, the Vikings found themselves trapped in their coastal villages and settlements, the world beyond them locked away behind frozen waters. They could no longer navigate the rivers and seas to conduct raids, conduct trade, or explore new lands. The sea, which had once been their gateway to new conquests, now became an insurmountable wall of ice. The familiar hum of the oars and the neigh, sound of the wind billowing through the sails were replaced with the soft, unsettling sound of ice cracking and the occasional gust of wind howling across the snow-covered land. The warriors, who had once reveled in their mobility, now found themselves in a state of enforced stillness. For a people who thrived on movement on swift raids, on long journeys across the sea, the enforced stillness of winter must have been more than just frustrating. It must have been disorienting, even demoralizing. The Vikings, known for their fierce independence and relentless pursuit of glory, had built a culture around constant motion. They were warriors, explorers, and traders, always on the move, always seeking out new challenges. But winter stripped them of that mobility. It was as though the very foundation of their identity was being put to the test. What did it mean to be a Viking when the seas were locked in ice and the rivers were no longer passable? The long winter months, spent huddled together in small villages, must have been a profound shift for the Vikings. The warriors, accustomed to the thrill of battle and the camaraderie of the raid, found themselves isolated from the outside world. The dark, cold months of winter not only trapped them physically, but also trapped them mentally. Without the usual outlets for their aggression, their energy, and their need for adventure, the psychological toll of inactivity must have weighed heavily on the Vikings. The fires in the longhouses burned brightly, but inside there must have been a certain restlessness, a longing for the open sea, for the rush of the battle, for the wind in their hair and the salt in the air. While the long winter nights kept the Viking warriors from raiding, it did not stop the other struggles that came with the season. The cold, the isolation, and the scarcity of food created a pressure that could build over time. When resources were limited, tensions ran high. The threat of hunger, of cold, and of isolation created a kind of simmering anxiety that could easily boil over into internal conflict. Villages that had once been bustling centers of activity now became quiet, with fewer options for trade, fewer opportunities for raiding, and fewer chances for replenishing supplies. The cold made hunting difficult, and a lack of fresh food placed pressure on the stored provisions. The Vikings were no strangers to the realities of rationing, but winter brought these realities into sharp focus. The fear of running out of food was a constant companion, and the struggle to maintain a steady supply created division and conflict. Among the Vikings, there were often disputes over resources, over who controlled what, and even over how to divide the food that remained. The long winter nights, devoid of the usual distractions of raids and travel, gave these tensions the room to grow. In a way, the isolation of winter acted as a pressure cooker for Viking society. With nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait for spring, the simmering tensions between individuals, families, and villages could boil over into disputes or even violence. The Vikings, often seen as a unified force, were still human, and the stress of surviving a brutal winter could sometimes lead to internal strife. The winter months, though harsh and cold, forced the Vikings to confront not only the external challenges of their environment, but also the internal challenges of their own society. Yet, despite the trials of winter, the Vikings were not passive in their waiting. The winter months, though filled with hardships, were also a time for preparation. The Vikings knew that once the ice began to melt and the days grew longer, the time to raid would come again. Winter was not a time for rest, it was a time for readiness. It was a time to forge weapons, repair longships, and hone battle skills. The longhouses, though cold and dark, became a workshop for the Viking warriors. The crackling fires that warmed the hearths were also used to temper iron and steel, to shape swords and shields for the battles that lay ahead. The silence of the winter nights was filled with the sound of hammers striking anvils, the sharp clang of metal against metal, as the warriors prepared for the inevitable return of spring. This time of preparation was not just about gathering resources, it was also about mental readiness. The Viking warriors used the winter months to reflect on their past battles, to strategize for the upcoming raids, and to strengthen their resolve. The winter months, though cold and harsh, were a time to ensure that the Vikings would be ready. When the ice finally broke, when the sea once again became their domain. As the cold winds of winter howled through the Viking settlements, the once lively lands of Scandinavia fell into a deep and prolonged slumber. The earth, shrouded in snow, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the return of the sun. In these long, bitter months of darkness, when the frozen landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, the Vikings turned to their mythology for understanding, comfort, and strength. To the Vikings, winter was not merely a season, it was a profound and essential part of their spiritual life, one that shaped their beliefs, their gods, and their very way of thinking about life and death. The cold of winter was not only something to endure, it was a force to be respected, a part of the natural cycle that the Vikings both feared and revered. The harsh conditions of winter were reflected in the very gods the Vikings worshipped. These gods were not abstract, distant deities, but figures who embodied the struggles, the battles, and the resilience required to survive in a land so dominated by ice and snow. The divine beings of Viking mythology were as much a reflection of the harsh natural world as they were of human nature itself. In the cold, the darkness, and the isolation of winter, the Vikings found their connection to the divine. One of the most important deities in the Viking pantheon when it came to winter was Skadi, the goddess of winter, hunting, and skiing. She was a giantess, a fierce and independent figure who embodied the brutal beauty of the northern wilderness. Skadi's story is tied directly to the harsh conditions of the coldest months, and her presence in Viking mythology reflects how deeply the Vikings felt the grip of winter on their lives. Skadi was not just a goddess of snow and ice, but of survival. In the most unforgiving of environments, she was a hunter, someone who knew how to navigate the treacherous terrain of snow-covered mountains and frozen forests. In Viking tales, Skadi was often depicted as a figure of strength and independence, someone who thrived in the cold and the wild landscapes of the north. Her name, which is thought to derive from the Old Norse word ske, meaning a dart or a projectile, symbolizes her connection to the speed and precision required to survive in such a harsh environment. Skadi's relationship with the cold was not one of simple endurance, was a deep understanding of the power and beauty of winter. In one of the most famous tales about Skadi, she is said to have chosen her husband from among the gods based on their feet alone. This story reflects the power of Skadi as a figure who transcended the usual constraints of mortal life. To her, the strength and resilience of winter were reflected in the gods who could withstand its harshness. She herself was a symbol of survival in the wildest, most unyielding conditions. To the Vikings, she was a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest times, survival was possible. It was not just about fighting the elements, it was about becoming one with them, understanding their power, and using it to one's advantage. Skadi's mythology also emphasized the importance of hunting in the winter months. As the cold descended, food became scarcer, and hunting for survival became a matter of great importance. Skadi was not just a goddess of winter, but a goddess of the hunt, guiding the Vikings in their struggles against the elements to find food and sustenance. In the stories of Skadi, hunting was not just a necessity, it was an act of reverence, a sacred duty that connected the Vikings to their environment, to the wild places that existed beyond the borders of their settlements. Another key figure in Viking mythology connected to winter was Ull, the god of skiing, archery, and hunting. Ull was an important deity in Viking life, particularly in regions where snow and ice were common during the long winter months. His connection to skiing was especially significant, as skiing was not just a recreational activity for the Vikings. It was a vital tool for survival in the deep snow of their homelands. Oller's presence in Viking mythology highlights the importance of winter in Viking life. Unlike other gods who were associated with farming or the warmth of the sun, Uller was a figure who thrived in the cold and the snow. He was depicted as a hunter, skilled with a bow and arrow, and as someone who could navigate the treacherous, icy slopes of the mountains with ease. For the Vikings, Uller was not just a god of winter. He was a god of the outdoors, a figure who embodied the resilience and resourcefulness required to survive in such a harsh environment. In addition to his connection to skiing, Uller was also associated with the hunt, an activity that was essential for the Vikings during the winter months. The Vikings hunted not only for food, but also for pelts, which provided them with clothing to protect them from the cold. Uller, as the god of hunting, was seen as a protector of hunters and warriors alike. He was also considered a god of archery, a skill that was highly valued by the Vikings, especially during winter, when survival often depended on the ability to hunt and provide for one's family. Winter in Viking culture was also marked by Yule, a celebration that held deep significance in the context of the long, dark nights of the northern winter. Yule, which corresponded with the winter solstice, was the longest night of the year, a time when the sun seemed to disappear entirely from the sky and the darkness stretched on endlessly. Yet despite the bleakness of this time, Yule was also a time of hope and renewal for the Vikings. It marked the symbolic rebirth of the sun and the return of light to the world. The Yule festival was a central part of Viking culture, and it was celebrated with great reverence and joy. During Yule, the Vikings would gather in their longhouses, where they would share feasts, drink ale, and exchange gifts. The Yule log, a massive log that was burned throughout the festival, was a symbol of the returning sun. As the fire burned, it was believed that the warmth of the sun was returning to the earth, slowly driving away the darkness and cold. The burning of the Yule log was a ritual that brought warmth, both physical and spiritual, to the Vikings as they waited for the winter to end and for the sun to return. The celebration of Yule was not just about feasting, it was also about community and unity. During the dark, isolating months of winter, Yule provided an opportunity for the Vikings to come together, to reaffirm their bonds with each other, and to celebrate their resilience. The cold and the darkness might have separated them from the rest of the world, but during Yule, they were reminded that they were part of a larger, enduring cycle, a cycle of life, death, and rebirth that echoed in both the natural world and in their spiritual beliefs. The symbolism of the Yule festival, with its focus on the return of the sun, was deeply intertwined with Viking attitudes toward winter. Winter was not simply a time of hardship, it was a time of preparation and renewal. The long nights of winter, though dark and cold, were seen as a necessary part of the cycle, a time when the earth rested and prepared for the coming growth of spring. Through Yule, the Vikings celebrated the idea that even in the darkest of times, light would return. Winter, with its long nights and harsh conditions, also played a central role in shaping Viking cultural practices. The long hours of darkness gave the Vikings the time to engage in storytelling, which was one of the most important cultural activities of the winter months. Gathered around the fire, the Vikings would listen to stories of gods and heroes' epic tales of struggle, bravery, and survival. These stories were not just entertainment. They were a way to teach lessons, preserve history, and provide a sense of connection to the past. The sagas of the Vikings, passed down orally from generation to generation, were often recited during the long winter nights. These sagas told of great warriors, of gods who walked among men, and of the heroic deeds that shaped Viking history. The winter months were when these stories came to life, filling the longhouses with tales of adventure, magic, and honor. The storytelling was more than just a pastime, it was a vital part of Viking identity. The stories reinforced the values of bravery, honor, and resilience that were so deeply ingrained in Viking culture. As the long winter months drew to a close, the frozen land began to show signs of renewal. The ice that had held the Vikings captive for months slowly began to melt, and the frozen rivers that had once obstructed their raids started to thaw. The days grew longer, the sun began to shine once again, and the world once cold and still began to stir with life. For the Vikings, winter was not merely a season to endure. It was a time of trial, a season that tested their resilience and their spirit. The cold, the isolation, the scarcity of food, all of these challenges served to shape the Viking way of life, and their ability to survive through these hardships became a testament to their strength and unity. The very nature of winter, with its stark contrast of darkness and light, life and death, made the return of spring all the more significant. It was not just the thawing of the ice that marked the end of winter, but the renewal of hope, the promise of new beginnings. The Vikings' relationship with winter was one of respect and endurance. They did not simply survive the cold, they found meaning in it. Winter was an inevitable part of their world, one that shaped their culture, their gods, and their worldview. Their myths, such as those of Skadi and Or, were reflections of their deep connection to the land and its harsh conditions. The Vikings saw the cold as a force to be reckoned with, not just something to be feared, but something to be understood and respected. They built their lives around the rhythms of the seasons, knowing that winter would come, but so too would the light. For the Vikings, surviving winter was more than just about physical endurance. It was a spiritual journey. The long nights of darkness gave them the opportunity to reflect on their lives, to bond with their families and communities, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. In the quiet, still months, they found strength not only in their physical abilities, but in their unity, their shared purpose, and their unwavering belief in the return of the sun. When the ice finally began to melt, and the rivers and seas once again became navigable, the Vikings would return to their way of life with renewed energy and purpose. The raids would resume, the trading routes would open, and the world would once again come alive. But winter would always remain in the background, a reminder of the resilience and the endurance that had made the Vikings the formidable warriors they were. Reflecting on Viking resilience, looking back on the history of the Vikings, it is clear that winter was more than just a season. It was a defining feature of their culture. The hardships of winter shaped the Viking way of life, and their ability to endure these trials is a testament to their remarkable resilience. In the face of extreme cold, isolation, and scarcity, the Vikings thrived. Their ability to adapt to their environment, to find meaning in hardship, and to rely on their community made them one of the most successful and enduring cultures in history. As we reflect on the Viking experience, we are reminded that survival is not just about overcoming physical challenges, but about finding strength in the face of adversity. The Vikings did not simply endure the harsh winters, they embraced them. They turned their struggle into a source of pride, knowing that the hardest times often bring out the greatest strength. They lived in harmony with the land, understanding its cycles and rhythms, and they knew that even the coldest winter would eventually give way to the warmth of spring. The enduring legacy of Viking winter resilience in the centuries since the Viking Age, we have come to see the Vikings as a symbol of strength, bravery, and adventure. Their long ships, their conquests, and their fearsome reputation continue to captivate us. But their true legacy is not just found in their military might or their exploration of far-off lands. It is found in their ability to survive the coldest, most challenging winters, and to build a culture that thrived in the face of adversity. The next time we think of the Vikings of their raids, their ships, and their epic battles, let us also remember the winter they endured. Let us remember how they survived the long nights, the frozen rivers, and the isolation that marked their winters. For in these challenges, the true strength of the Vikings lies not just in their ability to fight, but in their ability to endure, to come together as a community, and to find hope in the coldest, darkest of times. As the fire flickers low and the cold wind whispers through the cracks in the walls, we are reminded that, like the Vikings, we too have the strength to endure. The seasons may change, the cold may come, but as long as we hold on to our resilience, our community, and our hope for the return of the light, we too can face the challenges ahead with strength and determination.